Great, welcome everybody. My name is Gavin Smith. I'm a professor in the Department of Landscape Architecture and Environmental Planning at North Carolina State University, and I'll serve as the moderator for this session, which is focused on applied research and community engagement focused on resilience. We've got a great panel. I am not going to talk much. I'm going to defer to the speakers, nor am I going to spend a lot of time talking about their qualifications. You can certainly find those online. So what we're going to do is we're going to have Marci Jackson and Graciela Rivera speak jointly as a kind of a dual presentation. They're going to have 20 minutes to speak. David Perkes has not joined us yet, so Olivia will follow, Ph.D. candidate at North Carolina State University. And if David joins us, he will wrap us up. But then if he's not, we'll just have more time for a question and answer. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Marci to kind of get us started and let her talk to you about her work. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Gavin. So we're just, we're gonna co-present today with Graciela, and I'll just introduce myself real quick and then turn it over to Graciela to get started. So I'm Marci Jackson. I work with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. I am a Silver Jackets coordinator for Jacksonville District, and we have 3 Silver Jackets teams. I'll go into what actually that is, but you know, within the Southeast and the Caribbean. So we've got a team in Florida, Puerto Rico, and the USVI. Today, we're just going to focus on the efforts that we're doing with the USVI team, and Graciela and I tag team leading that team, and from that perspective. And I'll turn it over to Graciela to let her introduce herself.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for allowing me the opportunity to be here with you. I am Graciela Rivera, and I'm the Territorial Hazard Mitigation Officer in the U.S. Virgin Islands. I work for the Virgin Islands Territorial Emergency Management Agency. Next slide. Okay, as Marci mentioned, we have, recently joined efforts, and we're working with Army Corps of Engineers, and we've developed the first ever USVI Silver Jackets team. Our vision statement is it's an interagency team dedicated to improving the quality of life, infrastructure, and the environment by making the U.S. Virgin Islands more resilient to natural disasters. I'm sure most people know that U.S. Virgin Islands did go through Hurricane Irma and Maria in 2017, and we are currently in the process of recovery. Next slide. Okay, the USVI Silver Jackets team. The USVI Silver Jackets team is comprised of different agencies, starting with the Office of Disaster Recovery. That office is the one that coordinates all the disaster funding, be it from public assistance, hazard mitigation, federal highway. VITEMA is a grantor of the federal funds from FEMA. That's the Virgin Islands Territorial Emergency Management Agency. And we do work very closely with the Department of Planning and Natural Resources, and of course, Department of Public Works. One of the things that we're focused on with them is developing different projects that will help increase resiliency. And some of those projects actually have to do with protecting the coastal environment. And I cannot definitely avoid saying the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, they have been instrumental in the development of this team. The University of the Virgin Islands has multiple projects with us and has been also instrumental when it comes to data collection. NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, has definitely provided support, data, and information. And of course, FEMA, who is providing the funding and the training opportunities and the other items. This picture here was actually our first initiation meeting, and that took place on September 9, 2019. Marci?
All right, thank you. So I'm just going to give a little bit of an overview of what a Silver Jackets team is. It's basically an interagency team that is led by a state or the territory. So in this case, Graciela, as a state hazard mitigation officer, she actually helps lead the team along with the Office of Disaster Recovery. And so I'm just one seat at the table. The Corps of Engineers helped kick off the team and get it started, but really the idea is to have this interagency team working together all year round, not just in a recovery mode. So our plan is not to stop meeting after recovery is completed, but to have the team always there and available and connected to build that foundation. So when recovery efforts are needed or hazards do come, then that team's already connected and can more efficiently help be the island more resilient and continue to move forward. Next slide, please. All right, so I'll just stay a little bit and then turn it over to Graciela. This is our first active project that we have going on with the as the USVI Silver Jackets team, and the purpose of this project is to educate. It's an educational and outreach series on making communities more resilient, and one way we do that is through education and outreach. So our topics here is educating about what watersheds, how drainage works on the island specific, and then an overview of what all agencies are involved in dealing with watershed issues, and then what can we do about it. And so this is just a very rough outline of the first project that we're working on together as we help make the community more resilient. So Graciela, I'll hand it back over to you and anything you want to add there.
Yes, one of the things that we're looking forward to with this project is in this and other projects that we're doing, getting community engagement is very critical. So this is one of the ways that we're doing that. By having our community better understand what a watershed is, what the impact is, what the importance of it is to our water quality, will then help them understand the reason why studies are being done and that funding is being used to address that. When we incorporate action activities after those studies, the reason why. And once you get that engagement from the community and that support, it just helps all along the way. Next slide. Okay, now one of the key projects that we have in the hazard mitigation grant program is the Hazard Mitigation Resiliency Plan. This plan is actually being coordinated by the University of the Virgin Islands, and it's going to be the result of a multi-sectoral planning effort that includes principles and elements of resilience, sustainability, and climate adaptation. As I mentioned, the University of the Virgin Islands is the one that's leading this effort. One of the key things that we identified after the storms is the fact, well, the hurricanes, is the fact that there is a lot of lacking data, or if the data is there, we don't know how to access it. It's not coordinated, it's not shared. So one of the goals that we have with the Hazard Mitigation Resiliency Plan is to do that. I'm not going to go through the 4 steps really quick because I'm sure most people are familiar, but it's, organizing the process, assessing the risk and capabilities, developing a strategy, and the adaptation and implementation of the plan. Next slide. Okay, this plan, it'll be the cornerstone of all future mitigation activities, and that's why it's so critical. This plan also incorporates multiple studies that will show us the impact of, multiple hazards: hurricanes, storm surge, wind, rain, potential tsunamis as a result of an earthquake. So it is a cornerstone. It is the key element that we're going to be using in the future to develop mitigation projects and to make sure that the U.S. Virgin Islands is more resilient. This plan is guided by 4 core principles, which are resilience, sustainability, climate adaptation, sociocultural awareness, and capacity building. Resilience, of course, means that we are ready and prepared for anything that might come, be it a natural or a man-made hazard, and that we have the ability to quickly adapt to these changing conditions and be able to recover from any disruptions as quickly as possible. Sustainability is the ability to be able to, change quickly, to use the resources wisely, to manage our future growth, our investment, our technological development, and any change, and make sure that they are all working together and are in harmony for both the current situation on the island and the future plans and needs and goals of the community. Third, of great importance is climate adaptation. We have seen the fact that climate change is having an impact and is posing increased risk. So our goal is to use the data that we find to reduce the risk and to start anticipating adverse effects that may happen and plan the necessary steps and the necessary mitigation projects to make sure that we minimize that impact to the territory. Sociocultural awareness, even though the islands are small, we do have a very diverse community, and we want to make sure that as we proceed with this plan, as I mentioned earlier, we want it to be part of the community. We want to make sure that it's engaged. So we want to make sure that we capture all the different groups that live within the territory and make the USVI their homes. Capacity building. Another challenge that we identified after the storms is that there's gaps in the awareness, the new solutions, the new mitigation activities, and those different things that can strengthen and develop our islands better. So we want to make sure that we incorporate, we assess those challenges, those gaps, and we put a plan in place that will help build so that we can make the community more resilient. Next slide. The scope of work for the Hazard Mitigation Resiliency Plan is organized by 7 tasks. I'm not going to go into them with too much details. They're just by reading them through them, they're quite obvious. But the planning process, making sure that we get baseline data collection, analysis, and the capability assessment. As I said, these were 2 things that we found were lacking. We didn't have a lot of data, and if we had it, it wasn't consolidated or easily identifiable. And we did find capacity gaps and capability gaps that we're addressing. Risk assessment. It's not just hurricanes. We also have situations with droughts. We have heavy rains. We do have the potential. I'm sure you guys are all familiar with what's been happening with our sister island in Puerto Rico, and the earthquakes seem to be getting closer and closer. So we do need to make sure that we assess for the risk of earthquakes and tsunami and any other potential event. Of course, sustainability planning. We are islands, so we need to make sure that if something happens, we can continue or get back to day-to-day living as quickly as possible. And there are challenges that are not normally found in the States because we can't drive from one state to the next. Everything comes through a boat. And one of the things that we learn is when you depend on a sister island and that sister island also gets impacted, there's a lot of challenges that take place. The hazard mitigation, sustainability, and environmental policy recommendations, the development of the comprehensive planning strategies and framework, and plan publication, adoption, and maintenance. The key thing with this plan is we want it to be a dynamic document, one that is very much, the community is very much involved in, and that they feel they're part of the process and they engage with it throughout the entire process and within the adoption. Next slide. Okay, now I'm going to highlight some of the hazard mitigation grant program projects that we have. These are specifically watershed projects. We have a few. I'm highlighted one from the Department of Planning and Natural Resources, which is a watershed study that covers the islands of St. Croix and St. Thomas. On St. Croix, it will be covering 5 watersheds. Most of them are on the southern shore of the island, but we do have one which is Salt River, supposedly Columbus landing site, that is on the north shore of the island. On St. Thomas, we have 3. We have the Sierra Leone King Airport, which is an area that's actually might be incorporated into the SAC study, and the St. Thomas Harbor, which is that famous Charlotte Amalie waterfront area, and the Bolongo Bay watershed. One of the goals of this project is to make sure that the USVI develops a comprehensive watershed management study. The action steps for this project will include the development of flood mitigation plans and water quality improvement practices. We also have one with a private nonprofit, the Coral Bay Community Council, and that study is going to be covering the Coral Bay watershed on St. John. And that area has multiple sub-watersheds, so that will be a full analysis done, and the information will then be shared with the DPW, Department of Public Works, Department of Planning and Natural Resources, so that they can then identify mitigation projects that can be used for that location. So the importance of these projects is that these studies will help us then develop additional mitigation and make the community more resilient. Next slide. hazard mitigation projects that will have an impact on coastal resiliency. We have multiple projects with the University of the Virgin Islands. One is the Living Shoreline Database. This project will actually develop a database for the entire territory of the different types of living shorelines or nature-based shorelines, and the protection structures that can be deployed in order to mitigate any damages in those areas. This will allow for protection of coastal assets while also maintaining the ecosystem. The goal is to minimize impacts from various coastal hazards, ranging from swells to storm surges to sea level rise. We have the Coral Mangrove Restoration Project. This project will upscale coral and mangrove restoration in St. Thomas and St. John. And the goal for this is to have an effective science-driven coastal restoration program. This program will help reduce the risk from storm wave action and will benefit the community at large. As you guys can imagine, the U.S. territory depends heavily on tourism. And the byproduct of these incorporating these mitigation activities is that by protecting and developing the corals, you do make it more attractive for tourists, but you also create a situation where you minimize any surges that come into the island. It's one of the things that we saw post Hurricane Irma and Maria that had a significant impact. Last but not least, we have in UVI, we have the Microclimate Monitoring Network Improvement Project. And this project will improve current existing weather stations that are installed in different areas of the islands. And this will provide information on rainfall rates. It will monitor our freshwater supplies. It will provide continuous measurements on wind direction, wind speed, temperature, humidity, and atmospheric pressure. With the TNC, the Nature Conservancy, we have a coral reef flood reduction and cost effectiveness mapping. This project will also combine different modeling to provide high resolution, explicit valuation of the coastal flood protection benefit and the cost effectiveness of reef restoration for flood mitigation throughout the USVI. The core importance of these 4 projects is the gathering of data. The data that is gathered by these projects will then be used to successfully apply for additional grants, such as with BRIC or the flood mitigation assistance or anything along those lines. So we're really looking forward to getting these studies to strengthen those capabilities. Next slide. We do have some territorial-wide projects. These projects, as it states, territory-wide, and they actually more address the fact that with climate change, we are seeing an increase in rain and coastal flooding. So we have a project which is a flood buyout. This project will allow us to purchase an estimated 50 properties that are located, that have been deemed as repetitive loss or severe repetitive loss properties. These are properties that we have seen have documented impacts from flooding and have had maybe multiple use of the National Flood Insurance Program. We also have the Culvert Upsizing and Improvement Project. This project is being done in a 2-phased approach. We have 2 projects. The initial project is going to be a study of the territory that will determine the location of the various culverts, any improvements that are needed, and also what is the best methodology used to make that improvement. So that is the analysis part of the project. The second part of the project will involve the actual construction. Part of the analysis will be, obviously we won't be able to fix all the culverts that need upsizing, but at least we can identify the ones that are most challenging and have the biggest impact on flooding, drainage, and everything along those lines so that we can address those specific projects. We have the slope stabilization project. If anyone has been to St. John and St. Thomas, they're very hilly. There's a lot of high terrains, and that results in a lot of destabilizing of slopes affecting road areas and traffic ways after not necessarily a hurricane, but any major rain event. So this project will, like the culvert, identify those areas that need immediate assistance, prioritize them, and also determine what is the best slope stabilization methodology that can be used to address that problem. Next slide. Marci?
All right, thank you. So I'm going to cover 3 projects that the Corps of Engineers is working or has gotten approved. The studies have that will contribute to making the Virgin Islands more resilient from a flood hazard perspective. So we've completed 3 flood risk management studies. And the first one I'm going to talk about now is Turpentine Run. So this is on St. Thomas, and it was a flood risk study that we just completed in 2020 of this past year. It was a federal funded project that we completed through the Bipartisan Budget Act in 2018. So the purpose of this study was to reduce the flood risk in the Nadar community that is located along Turpentine Run. The project mainly consists of construction of new levees and channel improvements within the existing channel, doing some widening and some slope stabilization in that area. This is a project that that would protect for around the 25-year storm event. And this project was just recently authorized in the latest Water Resource Development Act of 2020. Next slide. All right, this next project that we're doing, it's also a flood risk management project, reduces flood risk in the Charlotte-Amalia area there on St. Thomas. So that is that main downtown area that Graciela referred to earlier. This project is to reduce flooding, and it consists of 1,500 feet of a culvert, a covered concrete channel, debris barriers, drop structure, and a gabion channel at the very upstream end. This project would protect for the standard project flood, so it would really reduce a lot of flooding there in that main area that is has some pretty steep terrain there and very flashy floods as it drains from the mountainous area. This one was also just authorized as part of the WRDA 2020 as well. Next slide. All right, so this is just a very conceptual plan here. This study is a smaller scale study that also reduces flood risk. It's done through our Continuing Authorities program. We also got it approved last year in 2020. So this was originally completed in the early to mid 90s, but it was never constructed. So this project was revalidated through the Bipartisan Budget Act as well. So the purpose of this is to reduce flooding in the State LaGrange area on St. Croix. And all 3 of these projects are approved from a funding perspective, and their next step would be to go into design and construction once appropriations or funding is received. Next slide. And this is our last study that I'm going to talk about here. It's the South Atlantic Coastal Study. So we are doing, the Corps of Engineers is doing a study on the entire South Atlantic coastline, including Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. So it goes from Mississippi all the way along the Florida coast, all the way up to North Carolina, and then both territories. And so today I'm only going to focus on the findings to date on the Virgin Islands. So the existing economic risk is $2 million, and that's annualized damages. So economic annualized damage. So in any given year, the risk to the Virgin Islands from an economics perspective, if a coastal storm was to come, you know, it's $2 million. So if a storm actually comes, it's much more than that. So that's just on an annualized basis. If you incorporate sea level change to that, we're looking more like the $5 million, and that's on an annualized basis as well. So like I said, much larger than that if that storm was to actually come. So within that, 2 focus areas have been selected to take more of a deep dive in addressing the consequences of a coastal storm to reduce the coastal hazard from a flooding perspective and a consequence, a damages perspective. So these areas are that have been selected, as Christian said, on St. Croix and Charlotte Amalia and St. Thomas. So the team is in the process of identifying risk management measures to reduce risk in these areas. The team has conducted many public workshops where they have worked with both local agencies and the communities in identifying these risk management measures. The study is scheduled to be completed sometime in the 2022 timeframe. So as you can see here, these are the needed actions that have been identified thus far from those public workshops. So I think we're just a little bit over our time, so I'm just gonna go to the next slide. And so that's what we have today for you. We have our contact information here if you're interested in learning more about the Silver Jackets program or any of the projects we talked about today. Feel free to reach out to us.
Great. Thanks, Marci. Thanks, Graciela. That's great. It's really good information for all of us. We're trying to get David Perkes to sign in. We're having a little bit of difficulty with that. So what I would suggest in the interim is why don't we go ahead and let Olivia Vila go, and then we'll continue to try to get him back online. And then we'll open it up to question and answer. And I would encourage all of you, all the attendees, is to feel free to start posting questions in the chat, and we'll go through those in the order in which they occur. Right. Thanks, Olivia. In fact, I think you were on mute. There you go. Thanks.
Yep. Okay. All right. So I'm guessing you all can hear me. If my audio goes off, just let me know. But just getting my computer set up. Okay. So hi, everyone. My name is Olivia Vila, and I am pursuing my Ph.D. at North Carolina State University. Today, I'm going to talk about one of the projects I've been working on in Robeson County, North Carolina, called Project Bridge. It's an ongoing project that's centered on empowering the community to build resilience in a way that reflects their needs and their desires. So I'm here today to give an overview of this project, but I would also, through the Q&A/discussion, would love ideas for kind of ways that I could apply the information and knowledge to communities near and far. So I'm doing this project any ways to apply it in a broader context and in a local context. So if you all want to share your experiences, I would love that. Next slide. So as I mentioned, I'm working on Project Bridge. So that stands for building resilience and innovation through diverse group engagement. And the lead PI is the amazing Dr. Bethany Cutts at North Carolina State University. And I just wanted to give a shout out to her because she's a superstar who has propelled this project forward. Next slide, please. So there's a handful of interesting ingredients to this project. But first is a general overview. We did 80 audio and video recorded interviews with citizens and community leaders about their Hurricane Florence and Hurricane Matthew recovery experiences and their visions for the future of their community. And a really cool part about this interviewing process was that we hired a group of paid community specialists to conduct those interviews. So we didn't do them ourselves, the community members that we hired did. Next slide, please. So these community specialists were residents of the community. They themselves not only experienced the hurricane and recovery processes in that community, but they also had deep community knowledge. They had pre-established networks and connections. And we worked closely and in person with these specialists. We hosted trainings to get them familiar with the project and to train them on effective interviewing techniques. We had weekly calls to stay up to date on the project and the interviewing process. We wanted to see how things were going, if anything needed to change with either the interview protocol or the recruitment strategies. We had workshops to discuss the emerging findings and the results, and discuss how we wanted to move forward in a way that reflected the needs and characteristics of the community. Next slide. So ultimately, these interviews were intended to serve as a way to generate standard qualitative interview data that we could transcribe and analyze. But it was also, since we video recorded the interviews, they were also intended to serve as footage for a community-based documentary or a series of community-based documentaries. This process and this documentary was based on something called the community voice method. And this is a method that Cumming and Norwood came up with, and it's a public participation method that's intended to yield more inclusive public engagement and more accurate understandings of local issues and local perspectives. Next slide, please. So essentially, the community voice method consists of 3 different phases. Number 1 was the participatory discourse analysis. And that's the part that involved conducting the interviews and developing the documentary. The second phase of the community voice method is the public deliberation phase. And that's where we host workshops to show the documentary to the community and have the community respond to the documentary, reflect on it, agree or disagree with the content in it, and really develop recommendations to overcome the obstacles that the documentary sheds light on. So currently, because of COVID, we've had to push back that phase because we really want to do it in an in-person format. Just the kind of feedback we've gotten from the community is that it would be more inclusive and more engaging in that way. So finally, the third phase of the community voice method involves the reintegration of the results into civic discourse. So really, that's what I see as the applied component, where you're supposed to get local stakeholders and organizations to use the information that was generated through the documentary content, but also the responses to the documentary, and use that information to support local initiatives, to support planning projects, to support policy development or coalition building. So before I get into that, I want to talk a little bit about the documentary itself. Next slide, please. So as you can imagine, after 80 interviews, we had a lot of data that covered a whole lot of themes. Some of these interviews went, an hour to 2 hours long. And the goal of the documentary video, so what we're going to do actually is have a series, and the goal is to have a series of documentary clips that we can put together into one long documentary video. But the goal of the video wasn't to try to encapsulate every single thing that was discussed. It wasn't supposed to be a report of all the interviews. We wanted to identify one strong theme that reflected a community issue so that we could make a focused documentary video lasting about 15 minutes was the goal. And then we wanted that theme to be something that could be relevant to current community planning discussions around recovery, mitigation, and resilience. So instead of the university researchers deciding what that theme or topic would be and deciding that in isolation, we turned to our community specialists who did the interviews and who know their community. We got together for a day-long workshop to discuss the interviews and what we wanted that first one theme to be. Next slide, please. So what we decided was that we would focus on the theme of water and the Lumber or Lumbee River, which was a topic that came up a lot and community members wanted to see action and change in relation to water and the river. So from there, this is once COVID kicked in, but we continued working. From there, we worked virtually, and we started identifying and stringing together clips for this documentary. So we had all the interviews transcribed, and the community specialists and the researchers looked through these transcriptions and identified quotes and themes that were consistent with that one clear theme that we identified in the workshop. And this was a collaborative process with the community specialists. And so once we would pick out kind of quotes that we thought were good, we'd put them in draft documentaries, and we would run the documentary draft, and we would comment on it, we'd provide feedback, we'd edit, and this was a constant engagement with them, and calls that we would do this over Zoom or over phone calls. And yeah, so that's kind of what the process looked like for developing the documentary itself. So next slide, please. So what I have here is, I'm going to show you a clip, and this isn't the documentary, but this is to give you some insight about what the kind of documentary looks like. It's a short teaser, but it's not a fancy production or anything, but the important part of the video was the important point of these videos was to string together and tie together community voices around an issue that maybe wouldn't participate in typical planning processes in the community. So if you can, I think we got it figured out. It's the slide with the documentary clip. I don't know if it's working.
Jennifer, you just have to click play again.
If it doesn't work, we can also move on. I was skeptical that the link would transfer well on the webinar. Okay, I'm sorry, everyone. I don't know if I'll be able to share it with you all, but I do have the link. Maybe could you go to the slide with the link, and maybe if you want, you can take a screenshot and go look at it. It's on YouTube. Yeah, there it is. So if you wanted to look at just short clips, these are like 2-minute clips. The documentary we did and have drafted is about 17 minutes long, but it's all around that one theme. So anyways, next slide, please. Okay, so currently we're in the focus grouping. We're currently virtually focus grouping the draft video with those participants who participated in the interviews and with community leaders. And once we finalize that documentary, we're going to host summer in-person, hopefully, workshops. And we're going to prompt deliberation around the issue that's being discussed in the documentary and identify community recommendations for action. So in that case, we have various sources of data here. We have the interviews, we have the documentary, and we have the community deliberation. And this all yields useful insights that can be useful for community planning and resilience efforts. So all parts of this community voice method are unique and useful approaches to community engagement, which again, the point of this method is to create more opportunity for inclusive public engagement, and the results are supposed to yield more accurate understandings of community perspectives, views, and issues. So the workshops are kind of as far as we've gotten to thinking about, but we're still missing an important component, which is that reintegration into civic discourse. So I see this as the application component, as I said before, And as researchers, this is a time where it may be easy to like sit down on our computers, analyze the interviews and the workshop data, write a paper, and be done. But this is really the last thing I want to happen. In reviewing the literature that's come out in relation to the community voice method, there's some general guidance, but not much. It's a very ambiguous part of the process. And to me, these documentaries can serve as an obvious tool for planning and incorporating more meaningful community engagement into the planning process. Next slide, please. So you'll often hear from people involved in planning say, we provide opportunities for citizens to attend and provide their input in planning discussions, but nobody ever comes. And actually, one person that we interviewed for our bridge project said something like that in relation to the recovery, mitigation, and resilience planning in Robeson County. And we recently did a call with our community specialists and our community advisors. And one person said, I know of these opportunities and I make the conscious choice not to go because I know they already have their minds made up and they're not going to listen to me and to what I want. I don't want to be there just to fulfill their community engagement requirement. So I'm not here to make judgments about these kind of contrasting experiences and perspectives, but I want to highlight something that's relevant to this audience and this conference, which is that for planning and decision making in communities, whether it's hazard mitigation, disaster recovery, resilience planning, community engagement and public participation is critical for developing plans and strategies that reflect the needs of the community, that are equitable, and that have the support of the community. You'll probably know this. But for most community engagement and public participation strategies, they're just not cutting it. From the methods that are used to recruit the public, the strategies that are used to solicit information, viewpoints, perspectives, and recommendations, and the protocols for holding decision makers accountable to the public feedback to make sure that they are actually using that information and not just checking the box. Our strategies for that are just kind of plain bad in most cases. And what's worse is that citizens are catching on. They're skeptical that efforts to engage them are authentic. And if they're anything like the individual I spoke to recently, they're kind of losing trust in the processes that are intended to represent them in community-based efforts. So we have an excellent process and a lot of experience implementing the community voice method. We have a lot of diverse voices, views, and perspectives, and soon we'll have a final documentary and kind of concrete recommendations from community workshops. But what then? How can we, the team, best apply this work? And this is where I would love to hear your feedback, both in terms of making the process and information useful to the community being researched, and making it useful to other communities facing similar problems. And I'm, of course, happy to elaborate and discuss any part of this project. Can you go to the slide with the picture? This should be the last one. I'm not sure if it's the next. Yeah. So I want to conclude by giving a huge thank you again to the PI, Dr. Bethany Cutts, the NC State students on the project, in particular, Laura Bray, who's about to finish her Ph.D. in sociology, and the community specialists and community advisory committee who have helped us every step of the way, and some of them are pictured here. So that's all I have for you today. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Olivia. So in the midst of Olivia's presentation, which is great, and certainly I would encourage you to enter comments or questions in the chat relative to her comment or question of you. But we now have David Perkes on, I believe. And so if we can see if we can connect David. Hopefully David will be joining us.
Okay, can you hear me?
We can hear you. I don't see your slides, at least I don't.
Okay, Okay, I can see my slides.
Yes, I see them now. Yes, they're up now. Okay, hey, David, I'm glad you could make it.
Well, I apologize. I kept logging on, and then it told me I was an attendee,
Okay.
and I thought, oh, there must be a different logon. So anyway.
Don't worry about it. Why don't you just tell us about your good work? Yeah, don't worry about it.
Okay, well, thank you. And it's so good to be here with you today. So I will be quick to introduce myself and then get into some work that hopefully will add to the conversation. So I am a licensed architect and a professor at Mississippi State University, and I run the Gulf Coast Community Design Studio, which is a program that we set up in on the Gulf Coast in Biloxi, Mississippi, right after Hurricane Katrina. And this slide is just a good kind of timeline to show how our work, as much of the work that you all are, that we all do in this work, that it began really even before the kind of language that we use now as resilience was really kind of the sort of unifying language. And we began really when it was more about rebuilding and recovering. And it really wasn't until somewhere that I think we all can sort of date it somewhere around Superstorm Sandy that I think we really began to develop, I think more clearly, the language of resilience, which obviously has proven to be so helpful because of how inclusive it is and how it brings together sort of what used to be a kind of separate world of disaster recovery and sustainability and bringing them together, I think, in a way that we're all finding to be an enduring way to talk about this work. So with that, let me sort of go through some of our work and hopefully it will add to the conversation. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, our work began on the Mississippi Gulf Coast right after Hurricane Katrina, when obviously there wasn't a lot of time for any sort of theory or trying to figure out sort of why we were doing it. It's just time to roll up our sleeves and get working. Next slide. And so we dealt right away with the sort of the landscape after Hurricane Katrina, which had thousands of destroyed homes and about twice as many flooded homes, but an impact that I think we didn't realize at the time that has proven to be a long-term impact then was the way the FEMA flood maps then were revised, and that's an impact that I'll talk a bit more about the long-term resilience challenges for coastal communities. Next slide. So our work from the very beginning was to, in many ways, engage the community, a community that clearly needed to have a voice in the work that was going on and to be able to participate. So this became a very familiar part of our work in various ways to bring the community together to begin to work in a way where they had opportunity to be part of the decision-making process. Next slide. So we set up our design center. Essentially, we embedded it in the community, in fact, in a building that was shared by other organizations. So in the same building that people are coming in to get to apply for various grant programs and go through case management, we were there and able to, in order to be completely integrated into the process of helping them work out then the plan for their own house. And this gave us then a sort of unique opportunity. Next slide, please. So this is one of hundreds of homeowners who we are able to work with in a very kind of individualized way, so that essentially of the 300 or so house projects, each one then, like Edward Parker here, had a house that they had a lot of say in the house design. And for us, this was really important to work with the community in such a way that we were actually building back housing that people would want to stay in for a long time. In fact, our sort of standard of quality was we want houses that people will pass on to their children. Next slide. So this is just a kind of gallery of, we end up doing around 300 individual house projects, all of them on different sites, all of them with different households. And in many ways, this is a very kind of incremental type of community engagement where essentially throughout many communities, working with a lot of neighborhoods to really work in such a way that it was sort of household by household, but a community engagement that certainly gave us a lot of kind of connection and a lot of ways to really be part of the community. Next slide. We also, in the work, became very quickly in need of becoming experts in how to build better. And so much of our work, both then and since then, has been around improvements in how we build in high wind and high flood environments. Next slide. And so this is essentially going back to that first slide of the challenges of coastal communities. So a few years ago, we were able to get enough funding to sort of go systematically, sort of community by community, and go through and do a survey of all the standing houses. So these percentages here are the number of houses in these communities along the Gulf Coast that are in a flood zone. And so as you can see here, nearly a quarter of our houses are in a flood zone, and they weren't necessarily, for the most part, built in flood zones. Flood zones then have expanded sort of on the ground under them. We also then were able to determine that of those, at least in the communities we worked with, of those nearly 60,000 houses, around half of them actually don't meet the current base flood elevation. So we have obviously thousands of households who are in a situation that is really challenging economically. Next slide. So a couple of things that we've been working on, and this is, I guess, we can talk about the applied research topic for this panel. A couple of areas that I'll highlight. One is the work that we did looking at the construction aspects of building in flood zones. So looking at floodproof construction, which, as I'm sure many of you know, is not really an approach for residential, but it is for commercial, at least up to a certain level. And so next slide, please. So we were able to get some funding from the Department of Homeland Security to actually do sort of mock-up construction of different construction types to not just do the research, but really demonstrate to the community kind of how different construction types with the right sort of care and detailing can be made so that they could be used in to build in flood areas. Next slide. So we then made our research, in a sense, into a kind of outreach, so that as we would then prepare for our flood testing, we would then have a kind of on-site sort of opportunity to get the floodplain managers, the developers, and building inspectors out to begin to think about these different ways of building. Next slide. So that work then was able to be put together in such a way that it's now become part of FEMA's work on floodproof construction for non-residential buildings. So this is sort of one type of, I guess, applied research that helps begin to do both the technical and the educational aspects of this work. Next slide. So the work that I'm going to talk about now for the rest of my talk is really around planning, around land use planning. And we have found and have done several watershed plans, and finding the watershed planning, the work of watershed planning and the possible projects that come from that, we're finding to be a very effective way to work to both build resilience by making improvements in watersheds, but probably as important, to build then awareness in the community around the importance of making sort of good functioning watersheds to add to the resilience. I think one of the things that we, I think, have come to understand, and hopefully are beginning to help others understand, is that there's two related aspects of resilience. One is the preparation for acute events such as a hurricane or a flood. The other is really looking at what we call flow change resilience, things that happen over time, things that affect a watershed to impact its is resilience. They have to do with development and land use and practices, everything from how farmers sort of deal with livestock down to golf courses and other users in a watershed. Next slide, please. So we have found in a lot of our projects, we've been able to get funding to expand the watershed planning into various environmental education projects, and finding that there's great value in working with public schools around environmental education, because you're not only teaching the children, but that work becomes easily used for the public to understand some of these issues as well. Next slide. In this project, this is actually, we partnered up with a local artist, a ceramic artist, and we actually made a ceramic watershed. They're actually painting, and it was glazed and then displayed with water. It was actually quite amazing that this artist worked with a group of children to do a ceramic panelized watershed, and then we ran water over it as a part of the exhibit. Next slide. So one of the things that we have learned in our community engagement work is that people actually are really well aware of and concerned about the quality of the waterways that go through their neighborhoods. So I'm going to talk a bit about a project we did. This is a little waterway, little urban waterway called Buyout that went right through the community that we were doing a lot of the housing work. And as we did community engagement work, some of the people were talking about how we need to do something to clean up the bayou. Next slide. And so this is, if you can look at the little map at the bottom, this is one of those examples. If you look at the 1958 map, where even though it was already coming into a neighborhood, this little waterway still had a bit of landscape around it. It still had a bit of meander to it to slow down the stormwater. And over time, when we began working a few years back, over time, this became channelized, only a few patches of sort of riparian vegetation around it. For the most part, it just become a channelized drainage ditch. And so not only was it not really functioning for water quality, it also did not function well for flooding. And so when we have a storm, instead of having room for the flooding to go out into a tidal marsh landscape, it was flooding out into the community. Next slide. So this shows just a section to give you a sense as to what we would do, kind of section by section, to get the funding to, in a sense, rebuild a more naturalized, both in terms of the meander, to get more shoreline and broaden it out. And next slide, please. But probably more importantly, with the cross section, and you can sort of see the upper cross section being sort of what we ended up with, which has adequate room for the tidal landscape, so that there's room both for the water quality and the flood capacity. Next slide. So this work then, and partly because of the way we work, the grants we get always require a lot of partners. This is actually the first grant was a 5-star grant, which actually requires 5 community partners. So working with the city, working with other partners, so the projects become not simply a construction project, but a great sort of environmental stewardship project. Next slide. So this shows, I think this is the summer after we restored this section of the bayou. And the next slide, please, shows sort of where sort of what it looks like now. Go ahead, the next slide. So this is so essentially we put in this gabion wall, and some of you probably know the gabion is a kind of wire cage, and we put both broken concrete from some foundations we dug up in the site, but also we covered over with oyster shells. So that provides a nice boundary between the part of the site that is left to naturalize and the part then that they mow. Next slide. So this shows the kind of amazing landscape that really quickly it goes from the the kind of replanting to naturalizing in really just a matter of a year or two. It's pretty remarkable, the resilience of this tidal marsh landscape. Next slide. And for us, this is really largely what the work is about. It's about the engagement around this work, everything from school children. We had high school kids from their biology class doing water samples and all sorts of community engagement, so that the project becomes really important to the community as part of their own improvements. Next slide. So this last project, just to give you another example, this was a similar project, a little bit more kind of naturalized site. This is actually right along the beach. So this is a really kind of beautiful spot where a little bayou, Weeks Bayou, then drained right out into a beautiful little sand cove out into the beach. And as you can see there, right along the road, you can see a kind of outline, that sort of, looks like the state of Virginia or something. But that right a few years before Hurricane Katrina, a person with a lot of kind of political power was able to kind of get around a lot of reasons why they shouldn't have built there. And they put in a retaining wall and built a big house there that then was completely washed away by Katrina. And so we were able to, one of our partners, the Land Trust for the Mississippi Coastal Plain, was able to, FEMA condemned the property, they were able to get it from the city, and we went in the next slide, please, shows our work. Oh, I'm sorry, I get ahead of myself. So one of the things that we want to do in this really special little landscape is to show and to highlight all within inside of each other some of our, I think, really kind of remarkable sort of ecologies that we have along the Gulf Coast. These are all familiar to you all, but to highlight them for the community. Next slide. So these are all taken right in the site. There's just this beautiful kind of different ecologies are all within reach of each other. Next slide. So this shows the work. We were able to take out the retaining wall and actually reuse some of the retaining walls to build a little outdoor classroom, and then to obviously to get rid of the fill and to then regrade it, put erosion control, plant it, and let it then grow back into a marsh. Next slide. So this shows it sort of right after planting, and then I think the next summer. And I guess this is, I think I just have a closing slide, but just in closing, I guess as far as applied research, our work is really trying to figure out, how do you take then, the opportunities that are out there and make them into projects that engage the community in such a way that we're both building in resilience, but also, and I think along with that, increasing the kind of environmental stewardship in communities to build to bring value to these important landscapes that are a key part of our infrastructure. And with that, I think I just have a final slide with, oh, okay, this shows that we put a little outdoor classroom there with a kind of something to help people understand the ecology. Okay, thank you, and thank you, and again, I'm sorry for causing stress by me not getting on at the beginning, but it's good to be able to share with you.
Hey, thanks, David. I'm glad you're able to join us. And I tell you, so we're going to go to question and answer. So if all of you could on the panel, if you could show yourselves on the screen, including myself, I'll do that. So we've got a number of questions that have been posed, and I'm actually looking to kind of, I was trying to organize them, but if you bear with me just a moment. So one of the first questions, and I'll try to seek out questions for each of the panelists, but one of the questions posed is, how are you measuring success or progress within the Silver Jackets outreach effort? And in fact, it might be interesting just to hear from not only the Silver Jackets approach, but are there other panelists that could speak to, the issue of kind of measuring the efficacy of the work that you're doing?
Yeah, I'll start it off, and then Graciela, if you want to add anything, feel free. Can you guys hear me? Okay. Yeah. So from the Corps of Engineers side, we actually get coordination funds to coordinate a lot of the agencies to keep the teams going. And through that, we have certain goals and objectives that we meet to try to tie it back to building resiliency and adding flood risk. So we have quarterly check-ins, like in a database that we actually, get measured on, and the performance of the team. So one way that, getting a common vision statement was one way that we used to measure. So officially having that vision statement that all the agencies agree to was a big milestone for us, and setting up the team officially. Although, we first met back in September, it took us all the way to July to really officially set up that team and come to a common vision to move forward. So that was one way that we kind of measured success from that standpoint, and having all of the agencies get on, a common vision to move forward. So hopefully that answers the question. Feel free to clarify if needed.
Great. Other, of course, my phone rings right in the middle. Other comments from Olivia or David in terms of kind of measuring the work that you're doing, kind of assessing its effectiveness?
But if I can chime in real quick.
Sorry, Graciela, I'm sorry, please.
No, not a problem. I was just going to say, as Marci said, it's still relatively new what we've been doing, but I had mentioned in our presentation that one of the challenges we had was data and the coordination and consolidation of data. So one of the things that we haven't had any community outreach yet, we're going to be doing that with the upcoming project. But one of the things that we have seen happen is increased communication within key agencies, and we have been expanding on that. So there's a better awareness, there's more communication, there's more coordination, and that has been great and needed.
Great. Olivia, thoughts about the question, measurement?
Yeah, so as I said, our project is still ongoing, but there are various points throughout the project where you can assess how well you're doing. And I just want to highlight the role of the community specialists here, which was part of this. Using the method that we used was to get diverse perspectives and to make sure there was good representation in the community. So throughout our weekly calls with the community specialists to see how recruitment and interviewing was going, we made it a frequent question, like how well are we doing with representation in the community? We were specifically looking to make sure that African American voices were represented, Lumbee voices were represented, a lot of different kind of social identities that maybe don't typically participate or were very well represented in planning or engagement processes. So having the community specialists who know their community and kind of know, who are able to make those assessments kind of on the spot and a little bit better, or can kind of discuss or communicate with others, that's one way that we did. And there was points where we're like, well, it looks like we're getting a lot of older, highly educated people. So how can we adjust to try to reach a different population? And I don't think that those conversations would have come up if it was just us working without the help of the community specialists or community advisors throughout. And then I think just constant engagement, we recently did a focus group with the draft documentary, and we're saying how well does this represent what's going on? And some of the people said, well, you're not really touching on this issue, or you're not really bringing this up. So that kind of highlights maybe where our work has fallen short, or how we can adjust and make sure that the kind of final product, documentary product in this case, is better suited to the community. So that's my comment in relation to that question.
Great, thanks. David, thoughts about that? And in fact, before you answer, I was looking at some of the questions, and I'm trying to combine some of them. And so there is a question also about measuring the effectiveness of ecosystem services. If that's part of your metric, or if it is through Silver Jacket's work, that would be a good addition.
Yeah, and I'll be real quick. So one of the, I think, real, nice kind of built-in aspects of a lot of the work that is grant funded is that these metrics are part of the grant. So especially, the funding we've gotten from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, and that it's actually part of the grant is that we do water quality testing kind of before, during, and after. We have a great environmental consultant that does biodiversity sort of surveys, and so that information is great because it's sort of built in with the grant, and it does give us then things that we can kind of point to, and we're able to then kind of show how there are improvements made. But I think for us, probably as important then is to see sort of the kind of community response. One of the things that we have been pleased with as we've done this work is that how especially with some of our, as we began some of this restoration on these little waterways, how they lead to other projects. The city of Biloxi actually just a month or so ago came to us and they said, we have some funding and we're looking to do a few, in fact, they said, we want to do more projects like what we did in Bayou Auguste, and we have some funding, let's put together then some proposals. So for us, that's a little bit more anecdotal, but it's still a good indication of how a project then can change the kind of the sort of what's going on, say, in the community, especially when a city begins to on their own begin to want to take on projects. So that, I guess that's what I would say. There's both some measurable things that are technical, and the things that are maybe not as easy to measure, but are still as easy to notice, I think.
Yeah, I think it's a great comment. In fact, I think it's a good segue to another question that was actually posed to Olivia, and talking about, and I'll paraphrase it, but based on some of the critiques, and you may be reading it as well, Olivia, but some of the critiques of public engagement efforts, what do you believe is the average timeline of a community voice approach and the associated costs for programs that you could take on at varied scales, including, for example, David looked at multiple scales. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so timeline, definitely it's something that is time consuming, and I feel like some people will be like, well, we don't have the time for this, we don't have the money for this, which is, it is a realistic thing. But I think that for projects, if you're committed to having a project that is going to be equitable in the long run, and it's going to be supported by the community in the long run, yes, it's going to take time up front. It's going to take more time, but is it going to make up maybe in the long run for projects that don't really reflect the needs of the community, that are going to fall short later on? I think if I had to give a number for this particular project, like an amount of time, if it was, if you were a team specifically dedicated to this, I don't know. It could be a year, it could be 5 years. I think a key thing about this project is not that you're like starting and ending a project, is that it's really just a continuous engagement with the community. So I wouldn't go in using this method when you're just trying to like find some quick data to use on a project. You have to be invested in that community and kind of start building relationships and building a process so that when the need for information comes up, you have that network, you already have the process. And maybe like us, we did interviews post Hurricane Matthew and Hurricane Florence. And there's so much information in there that is gonna be relevant to conversations that were relevant, in 2018, but are gonna continue to be relevant now and later on. So it's not like that data becomes outdated. Some information might become outdated, but I would see it more as like this long-term engagement with a community as opposed to a project that you're doing to collect very specific information.
Yeah, and I wonder if the panelists could think about this issue. In fact, it came up in an earlier panel when we were talking about green infrastructure, natural infrastructure, is how do you pay for it? How do you fund it? And related kind of to the question that Graciela, I believe, asked is how do you involve and how do you deal with long-term community engagement if you don't have the resources, if you don't have the money and the staff to do this? And I wonder, Marci and Graciela, Olivia and David, perhaps starting with Marci, think of, or if you have ideas as to how you develop partnerships that allow us to deal with this. To me, this seems to be one of the big challenges, is advancing resilience, especially in smaller, less resourced communities. If there's not an advocate like a David or a Graciela or Marci or Olivia, how do we make this real? How do we make it happen?
So I'll start. One of our biggest challenges is finding the right people in the community to own the message. I think you have to have the community push that movement for you. And so, finding the right people in the community that people trust, that's not maybe a federal agency or a local agency, but, there within the community that people already have an established relationship with. So I think that's one way that you start it, and someone that can carry that message throughout time, because it's important to them. It helps their community. And so I think having the community own it is the key to looking at the long term if you're strapped on funding, from that perspective.
I wonder, David, if you could talk a bit about that. I know you've been doing it. In fact, maybe even telling the story of you leaving Jackson or moving to the coast, and serving as an advocate, and you're still there, which is great. But we need more Davids. How do we make this happen?
I think so. There's a few things that happen, in any kind of region. There watershed planning that happens, right? And watershed planning, and it's something that we've learned that there's sort of at the level of the state, there's identifying, impaired waterways, and sometimes and often that watershed implementation plan kind of comes and goes without much community awareness. And so I guess what we're realizing is if you can, whether it's, a city working on their comprehensive plan, or you're working, with your environmental quality agency to do watershed planning, to find how these sort of kind of regular sort of activities, how do you open those up in such a way that they become much more of a kind of community engagement opportunity. And then from those, you look for how they can lead to other projects. So I guess all I can say is, if you kind of keep at it, the one thing tends to often open up the next opportunity. So I think it's a matter of wherever you work is to say, okay, if this is going to happen anyway, how do we enlarge upon it in such a way that we build into it the potential that it's going to then do more than just be a kind of document that goes on the shelf. And that's part of, I guess, what we try to do, is find those opportunities within what's already happening.
Great. Olivia, Graciela, thoughts on that?
Yeah, I was going to say, and actually Olivia mentioned it earlier when she stated that you consistently see the same group of people, which is good because they're the leaders, and you want to encourage the regular folks to come in. One of the challenges that we had when we started our engagement, it was public, but again, it was the same large PMPs that are always there, and there's a reliance in the community that they will take care of it. And we want to go past that. We want to touch different groups. So we actually found it interesting that with COVID, of course, we can no longer do public engagement. We had to move to Zoom, and I don't know if it's because people are like, I need to find something to do. We've actually seen our numbers go up with our Zoom public engagement, and if actually started reaching a broader group of people. Do we still want the opportunity to go to the elderly residents and go to the schools to speak to the students? Yes, because again, that is our concern. We want to make sure that we touch everyone in the community and make them get engaged. So I was very excited when I saw what David had with the different groups working together from the community to do things. And I'm like, okay, how can we do that here in the US Virgin Islands? And then Olivia mentioned community specialists. I'm like, okay, who can be the community specialists in certain groups that are either they feel marginalized or they don't feel as engaged. So I don't think I provided a solution, but I think those are things that, you know, that as we continue in this COVID world, to try and incorporate and create that engagement. So I appreciated the feedback that I got from the panelists very much.
Great. Well, in fact, you know, maybe you can take some of that's another benefit, of course, of the panel is you can take ideas back from others and take it to your communities. Yeah. Olivia, any thoughts?
Yeah, I was just gonna say I don't necessarily have any practical like how to fund this advice, but I will say, and this has come up through really everyone's conversations, is that the importance of having leaders and advocates in the community and people that care. I think it's really important to nurture that and to provide opportunities for those people who are showing initiative, because I mean, maybe they are volunteering at first, but if they kind of become experts or a source of good information, they can use that to build their professional background, and one day maybe get paid for it. And then in the end, they hopefully have a commitment to that community, and they'll be able to kind of return the favor, seek grants and stuff. And that's kind of like a long-term outlook. But I think that building kind of a sense of place and a sense of commitment in those advocates who can come back one day to those same communities and help them is important. So it doesn't really help you at that moment to like look for funding, but I think if you take that approach in the long run, it'll help, especially like rural and small areas that it's hard to get resources. A lot of people care about their hometowns and don't want to see them disappear. So I think that if you can nurture that in some way, that it'll pay back sometime down the line.
Great.
And I'll just add one last thing too. That's kind of the whole idea behind the Silver Jackets team too. You know, a lot of these federal and state agencies have programs and funding. So utilizing different funding resources within that team, you know, every year may have a different funding source may pop up. So having that team connected all year round also helps leverage, you know, funding opportunities with it. So we're all connected, you know, and can communicate those opportunities, you know, at an efficient pace.
Great. In fact, that's while we've got you on the spot, I'm going to just ask another, it's a more specific question, but I'd like to try to think about it perhaps a bit more broadly. The question is the Corps looking towards new flood-proofing solutions for flood walls to include techniques that might also preserve the community's viewshed as well? That was talked about a little bit in a prior panel. I'm wondering if you could speak to that, and then maybe David, if you have some design thoughts about that, including some of the work that you've already done.
I will admit I'm not the expert on the policies behind our flood proofing. I do know that within all of our planning studies, we do consider non-structural measures, which would be flood proofing, and we do consider the view shed and those desires by the community to not lose that. So that's really all I have to add. I don't have, you know, I'm not the policy expert when it comes to that, but those are things that we can consider within our planning studies for sure.
Sure. In fact, in this case, the gentleman was asking about, you know, the use of things like glass flood walls to deal with this issue of, you know, rising sea levels and more intense storms. He's having to deal with, you know, more rigorous protective measures, but also, you know, thinking about different techniques to preserve the viewshed. I don't know, David, if you have any thoughts about that from a design perspective, perhaps?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the lessons, and this is kind of going back, you know, that first slide I showed about this kind of conversation about resilience, and clearly one of the real lessons learned after Sandy was this, you know, very kind of high profile sort of program called Rebuild by Design, which essentially was kind of saying, okay, how do we take some of these infrastructure engineering needs and how do we make them into things that are also providing good places for people and good habitat? And I think in terms of you sort of seeing the resilience has an opportunity, and this is, I think, why we still keep working on this, as a lot of different partners. It has an opportunity to do more than just, make places safer against, say, flooding and hurricane. It has an opportunity to create beautiful places that are landscapes that have other ecosystem services. So I guess I would say it's all part of a kind of transformation that fortunately, that the Corps is also very much aware of, is how do we make the investment we put into resilience, which in the past we just saw as engineering, how do we make that into having multiple benefits so that people don't just see it as a kind of engineering solution, but one that creates great, recreation space and a walking trail and, all the sort of things that we're seeing now as a way to make these investments more purposeful.
Great. So I did want to pose, it's actually a fairly large question, or kind of a broad question, and perhaps ask all of the panelists to give some thought to it. We've talked about it a little bit, but this case, in each of your perspectives, and perhaps starting with Graciela, what are the biggest challenges in community engagement moving forward, perhaps in the pre-event environment, but as well as the post-disaster environment? And if even better, if you have the answer, that would be good. I'll be taking notes.
Since we're in the U.S. Virgin Islands, there's a lot of different challenges that might not really, be applicable in the mainland. But everything is a lot more expensive because everything has to be shipped in. And then, of course, there's the limited capacity and experience. So there's a lot of workforce that is brought from outside, and it just makes it very challenging because, of course, everything now it gets more expensive. COVID added to that. So the progress is not as quick as we would like. And one of the continuous challenges that we see is, it seems like every time you turn around, hurricane season is right there. And that is a challenge. I don't have an answer. That is one of the challenges that we face. One of the other challenges, and David referred to it a bit when he talked about the homes that were in the flood area, and not because they built in the flood area, it's just because of climate change. Well, we're on an island. And most of our coastline is in the flood hazard area. And most of our developments, our towns, our historic centers, our tourist attractions, that's where they are. My biggest challenge in mitigation is how can I get the funding to mitigate in those locations when it's a no-no to get funding for a flood location. That is something that if anyone here has any, and I know you were trying to pick my brain, and here I am trying to pick yours, but that is something that I'm like, these are special locations, buildings, historical, they have significant value for us in the community, and I can't find a way to protect them. And that is a challenge that I would like to resolve and find an answer for.
It sounds like you and David might want to chat because, David is a very humble person. He didn't talk about it, but he moved his design studio from Jackson, Mississippi to the coast to deal with this issue because knowing that a lot of people are going to stay. It's not as if everyone's just going to leave. Some are going to stay. And he's still there. He came there after Hurricane Katrina. So you might want to chat offline. But Olivia, any thoughts about some of the biggest challenges and perhaps some solutions?
I don't know about solutions, and I also don't know if this is the biggest. I guess it's one that I am concerned about, which is we spend a lot of time thinking about how to engage them, how to engage the public, how to engage stakeholders, but I don't know that we know that much or are that well equipped to do the next step, which is once you've engaged them, then what? What do you do with that information? How do you make sure that you're accountable to all those all that engagement that you did? How do you make sure that the decision that you come to is actually something that's based on the engagement that you do and not just, as the person that I referenced said, is we're just there to check the box. It doesn't matter if you get them excited and engaged and they give you great input. If you don't use it, that's what concerns me, is to make sure that it gets used in a good, empowering way for that community. And solutions, I don't know. I would need to think more about it. But
That's okay.
yes, okay.
Well,
I'll continue. If I think of something else.
So we're just at about time, so I wanted to quickly see if Marci and David had a couple closing thoughts, and we are going to have to wrap up the panel. It's already 4:30.
Yeah, I'll just follow up on Olivia's thought on maybe a solution. So we work on some pretty complex projects within the Corps, and we always engage often, but that follow-up is something that we've been trying to get better at. So even if we, processing all the data and the scoping comments and everything that you get from your public engagement, even if you don't have the solution right then, we found even going back out, whether it's through social media, an email blast, or even a virtual webinar, just to give an update, just to let them know that you're still processing their information, that here's the steps we have taken, here's what our plan is forward. To keep that engagement, I think, as a follow-up is what we have found successful in keeping the community engaged into the project, and how helps them understand how it impacts them long term. So, you don't have to have the solutions of, what you heard at the meeting, but just the follow-up itself, I feel like is a key success in building that trust to keep the project moving forward from our perspective.
Okay, great. David, we'll give you the last word on biggest challenges and perhaps a succinct solution, and then we'll all be able to fix all these problems we've been talking about.
Well, I think that in many ways, what we all should be striving for is to help the decision-making that goes on in our communities at every level to make it sort of driven by the community. And what we should all be striving for is that the work that we all do as we come at it as various professionals, that we're trying to help the community establish kind of resilient structures that are social structures. And to be real quick, I mean, this community that we started working in right after Hurricane Katrina has now, and it will, I think for a long time, it has this thing called the East Flexi Community Collaborative, which is a group of organizations that once a month gets together for a meeting, and it has happened and it's been going on for years, and I hope it goes on, forever, because essentially it is it's a simple but powerful structure where that engagement is not just for a given plan or given project, but it becomes a way of supporting and making decisions in communities. So I think that's part of what we should all be imagining, is how communities can begin to set up resilient structures so that they're working together continuously. And that, I guess that's why what I would end with is, as outsiders at times, or professionals, we should do what we can to help communities build structures that are really driven by the community.
Great. I think that's a good way to end this session. I'd like to certainly thank the panelists. Great job, great information. And as it's noted, the sessions are recorded. So those of you that are on the line are interested in going back and taking a look at some of the information, I'd encourage you to do so. So again, thank you so much. And we will talk to many of you in the not too distant future. Thank you so much for attending.
Okay, thank you.
Everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.